These are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to another webinar hosted by ExpoSoft. Today we have for you the good, the bad, and the metrics featuring Mike Lyles, Jay Phillips, and Rex Black. Just quickly give you a brief intro of ExpoSoft. We were founded in 2006. We are a quality assurance and software testing firm. We offer QA consulting as well as software testing services. We have offices in San Francisco, Beijing, Oslo, and Amsterdam. Really quickly, I'm Amy, and Jan is also joining us. He is located in the Netherlands. A few housekeeping tips. Everyone except the speakers will be muted. You can use the chat box or put in questions via the GoToWebinar control panel. And we're going to try and fit in questions as we can. Any questions that we can't fit in, we'll do at the end or send to you after the webinar is over. So now I give you to Mike Lyles, and hope you enjoyed the good, the bad, and the metrics.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome everyone. We're going to have some fun today. I think this topic was something that I've been very passionate about, and I'm very pleased to bring in Rex and Jay with me to talk today, because I think in most organizations this is a hot topic. And so if you want to go back, I just want to give a couple of things on Rex. Rex is well known in the testing industry. He is wrote his first book, Managing the Testing Process, sold tons of copies, and does a lot of conferences and speaking, and currently he's in Paris. So, and then Jay Phillips is the CEO and president of Project Realms and also Team Quality Pro, and she's got a lot to show us on some of the tools that she has been using, and the three of us have worked together on and off some time. I am a senior test manager for Lowe's Home Improvement. I've been in IT for 20 years, and my current role is I've been in various roles in testing, but currently doing performance automation and service virtualization. Okay. We can move to the next. So the questions I want to ask you guys today is, what is your story? You know, has your organization ever considered placing a tester that didn't write, for example, 15 test cases? Is your test team blamed if your defect leakage is greater than 5% into production? When you start thinking about these things and what drives those type of decisions, you start looking at test metrics. Okay. So when I think about the industry out there and what people are talking when you speak metrics, everyone has a different opinion. And it may range from people who think that the most valuable way to communicate is through metrics, using numbers, using various types of testing artifacts. Some think that it's useless, that it's misleading, it damages the communication, and that we don't speak with numbers, we speak with sentences and face-to-face interactions. And then some believe, of course, that without a measurement program, you're not managing the effort. And I'm one that believes that bad metrics are worse than no metrics at all. So the question is, where does your organization fit into metrics debates? Is your team aligned? Do you agree with the team? Is there a lot of disagreement and misalignment inside your own organizations or in your circles of people that you work with in testing? Do you have your own reporting process for testing results? And the key question, and I think a lot of organizations would answer this in various ways, is, are you forced to report on metrics that you don't believe are valuable? And do you have dozens of metrics that you feel that you're reporting periodically that no one even looks at? You can send them out, you could put whatever you want in there and nobody's seeing them. And the question there is, how do we change our organization so that the reporting gives you an opportunity to show the value and people want to see those reporting metrics? So we want to do a poll with the folks that are on board today. And the first question we have is, do you have experience with bad or negative metrics? If you can, just click yes or no. Okay, we'll wait just a few seconds. So, do you guys want to run the results of that, or are we just waiting right now? So, okay. So what we're hearing is that bad and negative, we're getting a lot of inputs from folks saying that this is really the case. And I'm not surprised by this number that 69% have stated that a lot of times we're using bad or negative metrics. That's probably a very true number. Rex or Jay, any inputs there?
I've had bad experiences with metrics as well.
Yeah, I vote yes on that too. It's one of the things that we need to resolve in the metric world.
Can I pass on a little anecdote on that?
Yes.
So I was working with a client once and was looking at a package of reports that they got from their the company that was running their testing for them at that time, and I was trying to redesign it to come up with something better. And I went, and this report, it was produced daily. It went to all the participants of the project, and it was probably about 50 to 60 pages long. It consisted entirely of analysis of test case counts of one sort or another, or metric counts of one sort or another. And so I went to the project manager, who I consider to be sort of the key audience member. You know, if her information needs weren't being met, we definitely had a problem because she couldn't manage the project. And I said, hey, I'm thinking of cutting this down a little bit to make it a little more manageable, something on the order of, say, 4 or 5 key metrics that you want to look at every day. So can you tell me which of these slides you use to really gain insight into the project? And she said, oh, that damn thing, I don't look at it at all. I just throw it in the garbage.
And it's true. I think I've seen situations in organizations where metrics are known incorrect, and if someone was reading those, they would notice that someone should be in serious trouble if those were true and accurate and working as designed, because the numbers that are there are showing such a horrible status of the testing effort that if someone in the executive management level actually looked through it and saw it, they would be very worried about the situation of test. Okay.
Or the brain power of the person producing the metrics.
Yeah, right. So, everyone, I want you to think about 4 things we're going to talk about today, and this is where I've asked these guys to be on the panel with me, and for us to discuss four major topics. The first one is the top metrics that are misused or misunderstood. Second one is best metrics that everyone should use. The third one is the worst metrics that you should avoid or remove from your organization right away. And then we want to lastly look at what tools and processes that can help you and your organization better measure your testing. So, second. Let's move to the next one. So the first one is, what metrics do you see in the industry that are predominantly being misused or misunderstood by organizations? And I want to skip to the next slide just for a second, and then we can come back and use this as the front when Rex and Jay speak. But to me, the one that I put on this slide is the defect leakage. And it's a great metric, but it's misused and it's misunderstood many times. And the reason I feel that it's misunderstood is a lot of people will look for that line to go down and watch for it to hit the bottom. The problem is if you're not measuring the severity of those defects, and if let's say I had 100 defects and I resolved them in development testing, but then I get into system integration testing and I find less and less as I move along, but the last ones that I find in production are the most critical defects. I'm not sure that this speaks well to the quality of the product if we're not finding the critical ones early. So Jay, Rex, floor is open for you guys. What do you think
Jay,
are some of the predominant?
Jay, you want to go first?
Sure. Some of the main ones that I personally think are very misused are anything that usually has a total count without the breakdown. So, for instance, if you just have total number of test cases for a release, that doesn't tell anybody anything other than a flat number. So one of the biggest things that I always recommend people to do is to break it down by module or functionality so you can actually see where testing is actually occurring within each area, and same thing for defects. So this way you can actually see, if your defects are being found in one area versus another, it makes more sense to everybody within an organization. I always just stay away from, ones with just a total count. Have something that breaks it down a lot better.
So I guess I could probably go on with a few of these, but I'm going to start with the one that bothers me the most when I see it, which is when organizations take a metric that measures a process capability or project status or product status and use that to measure individual performance and assign rewards and punishments. And I can give a couple examples of that. We worked with one client where we went in and we were looking at their defect management process, which they knew was broken, and we were trying to help them figure out why it was broken and where. And they had 8 different groups, 8 different portfolios that were separated within the organization, and we did a lot of slicing and dicing of their defect data as part of this assessment. We noticed this curious pattern that in 7 of the 8 portfolios, the severity distributions were pretty much the same. But then in one of them, they had a very low number of severity 1 defects, which was kind of like how is that? Their total number of defects was, proportional to their head count, about the same as every other portfolios, but the distribution was off. Come to find out that in that portfolio, the developers, as part of their annual performance evaluation, had a maximum number of severity 1 defects that could be reported against their code. And so what would happen is once they started to get close to that maximum, they would start begging the testers to not file any more Sev 1s against their code, but just to report it as a Sev 2, and they would then swear to the testers, look, we'll fix it. You don't have to call it a Sev 1. We'll fix it, we promise. But so, it was skewing the metrics, and the metrics weren't saying what people were saying, what they thought they were saying. And of course, the management's probably looking at it going, see, it accomplished the results, but in reality, it hadn't changed anything other than behavior. And a more extreme example we saw with another client where they had set this up so again, the developers were rated based on how many defects that were found in their code once it went into production, but the magic number was 0. And the testers were rated by how many defects were found in production when in areas that they had tested. And here again, the magic number was 0. When I say magic number being 0, it's like if you give above that, that's considered a mark against you on your performance evaluation. And this was just the most dysfunctional organization because the developers would never admit that there was a bug in their code. They would expend endless amounts of energy trying to insist that it was in somebody else's code. While the testers would always be arguing about whether that was in or out of scope. And it was just, incredibly dysfunctional. And oddly enough, the manager who had put this in place, I asked her, what's up with that? Why are you doing this? She's like, well, we wouldn't want any favoritism or anything like that in the way the performance evaluations are done. We thought we'd just make it all completely, quantitative. So that is, I think, the most corrosive misuse is that holding people accountable for things that are not really within their control.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think people should be rated against how many defects they find and log, because you could just have a ridiculous number of defects being logged just to get a higher number, and that would just not be correct.
Okay. One of the questions from the audience is, well, one of the inputs they had was a total number of test cases for release is usually misunderstood. What do you guys think on that?
I'd agree. Yeah, I mean, test case counts are completely abstract, right? I mean, a test case is an abstraction of basically what you want to test, and you know, we see plenty of situations where test cases are not of the same size, so you've got basically very little comparability. People haven't figured out how to normalize the test cases. So yeah, test case counts, I think, are perfectly useful to a test manager as a way of managing the work and making sure that all the tests are getting done on a timely basis and according to the planned pace. But as far as exposing those metrics as a measure of product quality, that's just a huge mistake.
Yeah,
And one that, go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, I agree with that, because if you're just showing a number that's a total, to me it's not valuable and it's not actionable at all.
And one that I got off Twitter because I was asking people to tweet this morning on their thoughts was the number of test cases left is very misleading because it doesn't take into account the complexity or the effort involved in doing those test cases.
I would agree, but again, I would say from a point of view of me as a test manager, I know how to use that metric and I know how to interpret it because I know which test cases are left, and so I'm able to look at that metric and know what it means. But what I found is when you show that kind of metric, you know, any kind of test case count metric to people outside of testing, you have to be very careful, and it requires a lot of education to make sure they don't misuse it.
That's true. One question from Ramesh here is, how are metrics measured with respect to industry standards? How do we make use of the metrics in the TMMI model, and how do they differ from CMMI, PCMMI, ITO, or ISO-based standards, followed by IT industry?
Well, that
Jay, you
really
want to take that?
varies. Oh, sure. That really varies per project and client, because, for instance, I previously had a client that, you know, they wanted the CMMI template and the metric in place, but yet they weren't following CMMI. So, of course, the metrics never really matched up to say, yeah, you're CMMI level 3 or 4. So usually if a company or an organization is trying to put some kind of industry standard, but they're not really going with the industry standard really, then they need to determine what their actual standard is so people can try to, you know, reach that goal and number.
I'll chime in here as the contrarian and say that I have never seen anything in any industry standard that I would say provides a universal solution to an organization with respect to what to do in a metrics program. There are certainly best practices in terms of what to do and not to do with metrics, but as far as some kind of, Chef Boyardee can of SpaghettiOs, open it up and pour your metrics into the soup pan and heat them up and away you go kind of thing. No, I've never seen anything like that. And if any organization tried to do that, it just takes something right out of the box and use it. I would say that would probably be a failure indicator for their metrics program.
No, I have to agree with that, Rex. I think a lot of times we try to make it, here's what everybody else is doing, and I've seen folks do that and say, well, let's go out and see what everybody's doing. I've been subject to that many years ago myself, and what you find out is it really needs to be tailored to what you're doing as an organization. You know, how you present it, we can debate over that, but do you follow a mold, or you know, there's some things you can follow, but a lot you cannot.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think the important thing too is it's about informing an audience, right? So if you start with a set of canned reports or metrics or what have you that were developed in some organization, well, you know, how similar is that audience to your audience? There's generally not going to be a lot of contextual information about that that's available. So if your audience happens to be a total, you know, clone and carbon copy of the audience that the metrics were developed for, well, guess what? You're lucky and it'll work. But if not, and which is the far more likely scenario, then you're going to you're not going to be meeting your audience's information needs, and you know, you're going to have a match between your organization's objectives and the metrics. So it's just silly.
Agree. So I've got two questions here. One from Matt on, and it's a good question. What are the purpose of metrics and how can they be done well?
I guess one of the big purposes is to show, you know, kind of visualize your story of what you're trying to present, because, you know, management always wants to know what's going on, when is it going to be done, or how is it going to be done. So it is a good purpose. However, if it's not understood by everybody, meaning, you know, example is what do metrics actually need, how it's formulated, and what you're trying to reach, then they're going to be misused and misinterpreted. So that's one of the big things, that if you want metrics to actually be used well and understood, everyone has to agree with what you're trying to measure in the first place. I'm not sure if Rex would agree with that comment that I just said.
Yeah, for the most part, though, I think I was kind of thinking about this a different way. Of, to me, if I look at a metric, I'm going to ask, you know, what am I trying to do with it? Am I trying to measure process capability? Am I trying to measure project status? Am I trying to measure product quality? And the thing that makes that makes the metric good to me is that it's, I mean, part of what makes it good is it's directly traceable back to some sort of objective that the organization is trying to achieve. That one of the ways that one of my clients put this well when I was working on a metrics project with him was, he said, you have to be able to answer the so what question for every metric. If there's a metric out there and different people would look at that and think that was associated with some different goal or objective, then that's a problem. It has to be clear as to, this is why we are measuring this. This is what we intend to learn from it.
Yeah, agreed. So the one last question in this section, and I think we could do this webinar for 4 hours and talk on each one of them an hour at a time, but from Rainer, I got a question that says, I think it is important to tell the story behind metrics. For example, the number of executed test cases per time goes down, but perhaps half of the testers are on vacation. I have been subject to that myself. I think you have to be careful in measuring productivity. It's a good thing to measure, but you have to understand how you're going to measure it if you're going to do that. Because if you measure productivity, two things will happen. People will behave differently. We've heard of situations where people have changed the lighting to darker and lighter in the office and measured that and said productivity's gone up. And we're going to talk to that in a few minutes with a slide that Jay added. But I think one of the key things for test case productivity is if you're measuring how many one person does per day, then if you're not careful, you'll have people to start running the easy ones first and not doing the important test cases. And you know, I think it's a training thing, and it's speaking to the team, but it's definitely one I think that happens.
Oh yeah, I have personal experience with seeing that kind of thing happen. Where I worked in an organization once where they were running tests for clients. It was an independent test lab, and they used contractors, a lot of contractors, and basically there were hours scheduled for test cases and you had to finish the test case within the scheduled hours. Now, the reason that that happened was because there was they did all of their work on a fixed bid contract. So if people went over, then that would end up having financial implications. But I think it was just a mistake, and to think that the right way to do that was to basically reward people to spend less time. If I were working there now, I would go about that a lot differently than the general approach that was used by all of us test managers in that lab at that time.
Okay. So Amy, John, let's do the next poll. So to the audience, do your managers understand the difference between process and people metrics? You can vote now.
That's an interesting result. I'm not surprised at the 62% saying yes, but I am honestly surprised at the 40% saying no. Or no, I'm sorry, the other way around. The fact that there are so many that would say that they do understand it is a shock to me. My experience would be that it would be, if you really got down to it, that you would find that a lot of managers really don't understand the difference between those, and then the process metrics are often misused to measure and reward people. So to say that 62% say yes, I guess we have some very lucky people on this webinar today.
Okay.
What I think some of the managers that do understand what the metrics are and what they're trying to do are ones that used to be the testers or doing the work before. But ones that are just managers, I don't think they really understand the metrics until somebody actually is able to sit and explain it to them. So I am actually surprised that, as well, that there's 62% has a yes by it.
Yeah, I mean, this misunderstanding is so famous that it's the essence of that Deming red bead, black bead experiment. That's the whole point of that, is to show this problem and the pernicious effects it can have.
Okay. So let's go back to the slides. So just one back. So the next question we have for the team, for the folks here, is what are the top metrics that you would suggest for any organization to use, and what are the most common? And Rex has asked me to put one that we've been using from an executive panel level, and I'll let him speak to this slide and kind of what has been done for this next slide.
Yeah, so this is an example of what I think is a good senior management and executive level dashboard. So starting at the upper left with the executive summary, what's being measured there is the status of the requirements. So in this particular test management system, you've got traceability of the tests back to the requirement specifications, which are the test basis. Now, we can have a separate discussion as to whether requirements by themselves are an adequate test basis, but if we just say to the general rule of this is measuring the status of what we intend to test, what we can see here in this example is that 45% of the requirements have been tested out as good, meaning that all the tests associated with them have been run and passed. And 27% of the requirements are known to have one or more problems associated with them, in other words, a failed test. And the rest of the requirements are in the black, or in sort of an unknown, in the sense that there aren't any known failed tests associated with them yet, but they haven't yet all been run. So this gives you kind of a big picture, well, what's the status of the product. Moving to the upper right, the coverage breakdown, again using traceability, we were able to look at the status of individual subsystems. So in this is hypothetical. There are 6 major subsystems, A, B, C, D, E, and F. And for each of those, we've got 2 data sets. We've got the defect data set, which is the blue and yellow, and then the red and green data set is the test case status. And what you can see is, for example, if you look at subsystem B, that's in substantial trouble because 15% of the tests have failed, and fully 35% of the defects that have been reported against all of the subsystems are reported against this particular subsystem, and most of those are still active, so they're remaining to be acted on. Contrast that with subsystem F, where 95% of the tests are passing, the remaining 5% are failed, so all the tests have been run. There are very few defects relatively, given that all the tests have been run. There's only about 12% of the defects have been reported against this particular subsystem, and those are mostly closed. C is kind of an interesting case in that we haven't run very many tests. We've only gotten through 20%, but so far they're all passed. What few defects we found here have all been closed. So this really gives you kind of a subsystem by subsystem perspective on the application and what its status is, how close to fully tested it is, and so forth. Now, continuing around clockwise, if you look at the defect trend, this is just a standard defect status chart. It shows the total number of defects reported in yellow, which might be a little hard to see on your screen. It shows up better when it's printed. And then we have the total number of defects that have been closed, which is shown there as the blue line, and then the difference between those, which is the total active, is shown as the dotted red line. So you can see that we're down in the 35 number of defects active. And then we have the test execution progress. So this is just showing planned versus actual. So the gray bar is planned and the black bar is actual. And we're showing the pass and the fail numbers there as well. So what we can see is that the system has started to shape itself up here to some extent over the last few weeks. Though, clearly we have some things to worry about with respect to subsystem B and to a lesser extent, I guess, subsystem E. This gives a good overview. It doesn't drag the stakeholders into the weeds and force them to navigate through a bunch of test case counts and bug counts without giving them any context to put that in, starting at the highest level and then providing some detail in terms of where we are in the project. So I think this one is actually a very useful way of presenting metrics in a balanced way.
Okay. But let me speak to 2 questions that we've got here that kind of roll into this as well. And I've had this question on this very set of data right here. And that is it is it different? Are there better metrics for agile testing, for exploratory testing versus traditional testing, if there is such a term as traditional versus those other? But, you know, is there variations of how you would report or measure things based on whether it's a quote-unquote traditional testing versus exploratory versus agile?
The main difference is not so much test technique being used or life cycle being followed, but it's more a matter of scale. I mean, if you're looking at this metric, this dashboard here, I mean, this is was built for a project that had on the order of 1,000 plus test cases or 10,000 plus test cases and 1,000 plus requirements, and it had, I think, a few hundred people working on it around the world. So, you know, you need something fairly sophisticated when you're managing something at that level of complexity. If you're talking about a 7-person Scrum team that's managing the development of a simple e-commerce site, you know, you could probably get by with the Kanban boards and that kind of thing, and as long as everybody's immersed in the details of the project and everybody understands what's going on.
Okay. You guys ready for the next one? Or Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, we can go to the next one. I just wanted to point out that I think that between the test execution progress and the defect trend being close together like this gives a lot better of a visualization to people looking at the metric instead of having to flip-flop between slides. That's all.
Yes, yes. So let's look at what metrics organizations should avoid. One of the questions on the panel, one of the questions from the group was DRE, looking at defect removal efficiency. Is that a valuable metric or a waste of time? Opinion from the panel?
Well, that's kind of a yes and no. I've been at multiple different client sites, and they've always wanted the DRE in place, but yet they never really understood why they wanted it other than they heard the formula exists and they think it's cool. So really, I don't think it's really a valuable metric to have unless you can really understand where that leakage is actually happening and the removal. Because, for instance, one of the clients we had, it looked like defects were being, not found early in the life cycle, but it was really because people weren't logging it. They were just, finding it and then working developer side by side, fixing it right away. So of course your defect numbers change, but that also impacts your DRE numbers. So if you're not, so basically what it comes down to is if you're not going to track, and log your defects and your test cases correctly, then your metric really comes out, it's going to be garbage in the end. And so those kinds of formulas really won't be relevant.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. You've got to have valid underlying data in order for the metrics to be right. And I always say that there's basically 3 components of that. There's one is you've got to have your collection mechanism set up so that you actually collect the data properly. You've got to have people trained in how to use that collection mechanism so that they know how to do it properly. And then you have to make sure that you don't introduce any sorts of perverse incentives or disincentives that are sending them the message that they should do it improperly.
Okay.
I think another thing worth saying with respect to DRE is what are we measuring with DRE? Because we're not actually measuring the testers with that. If you're actually measuring what Capers-Jones means by a DRE or defect removal effectiveness, you're measuring the effectiveness of the entire team, developers and testers, at finding and removing defects, as well as the whole management team, project management team, in terms of defect prioritization and so forth. So this is one of the main misconceptions of this metric, is that well, you know, the testers are responsible for the bugs that are found in production. Well, no, I mean, of course they can't be, because they just find them, and then if the bugs don't get fixed, you know, that's a whole different story. So it's interesting when people talk about DRE as a testing metric. It is actually not a testing metric. It is a metric of the entire process.
Sure. So I have a question here from Michael. It says, I agree that test case counts are bad because there is no scale for what constitutes a test case. It seems to me that requirement has a similar problem. How do you count a requirement?
I mean, a requirement is something that somebody needs to get done. There's not a scaling problem. There is a, you know, different people need different things to get done. There's no more a scaling problem than there is with that than there would be in Agile with counting user stories as they move across the Kanban board. You can make the same argument of, well, you know, one is of a different complexity than the other, and yeah, okay, so that's an implementation detail. But from the point of view of the external stakeholder looking at the project status, they don't want to hear a bunch of mumbly-jumbly about, you know, relative sizes of requirements and those sort of things. What they want to know is, are my requirements being fulfilled?
The follow-up question here is, if test case counts aren't valid, how can the passed-failed test case measurement, a derivative of the test case count, be valid?
Can somebody put that in context?
That's all I've got on the question.
Well, assuming that it's in reference to the core 4, then I think it's not what that slide is showing you is all those things are in relation to each other. So you're not the attention is not being drawn to the case counts associated with a particular subsystem by itself, but it's in reference to each other. That's why, if you notice, when I went through it, I was talking about how subsystem B looked like it was in much worse shape than subsystem F, and then I pointed out the reasons why. Now, might there be some outliers, if you will, like really big test cases in some places and really small test cases in others, and really critical defects in some places and really critical defects in others? Yeah, there might be, and you'd have to, as a test manager, look for that. But in general, those are outliers. You know, and I've heard this argument plenty of times about, oh, well, you're not measuring what you really think you're measuring, and you know, the fact is that those outliers will tend to come out in the wash, and if you as a test manager understand the data that you're working with and you can be sure that it is valid, they are coming out in the wash, then you're fine. And if it's not, then you should be able to advise people on that and say, hey, I think this metric actually looks like it's telling us one thing, but it's telling us something else. And, you know, this is not unique to us in testing. I mean, you see psychologists and economists do this all the time. You know, you use the metrics that are available to you. Are they imperfect? Yeah, absolutely they are. But if we're going to wait around until we've got perfect metrics, well, if people waited around until they got perfect metrics, we'd still be in the Middle Ages.
Sure. Anything, Jay?
No, that one I agree with Rex on. Hey, wait, this is recorded in the meeting. It actually is recorded that I agreed with Rex. Uh-oh.
It's just heresy, I tell you.
I have one question here. It says, should people who don't understand or support testing even be given purely quantitative measures? Or do we err on giving too much quantitative information that misleads?
Can you repeat that question, please? Oh, sorry.
Should people who don't understand or support testing even be given purely quantitative measures? Or do we err on giving too much qualitative information that misleads? I think the key here from Mark is, you know, I think what he's trying to ask is, do we give too much data to people who don't understand how to use it?
Well, that's just life, really, and everything. But that's kind of why I always go back to don't deliver metrics to anyone, whether they're in testing or not in testing, unless you're able to explain and back up that metric. Because without someone understanding it, so for instance, Mike or Rex could give me a chart, and without someone explaining what's on it, I might just come to my own conclusion of what they're trying to tell me. And that's kind of something that you don't want. So it really doesn't matter what, division or organization you're in. As long as you can understand what that metric is, you should be able, to start reading it and understanding it. I'm not saying you'll always be able to understand it, but there should always be someone that can explain it.
I would agree with that. You should never put a metric in front of somebody else that you don't understand and can't explain yourself. I saw someone do that once in a project management meeting, and the project manager picked up on it. You know how some project managers just have that kind of sixth sense of when they're getting BS'd by somebody, and just laced into this test manager and started asking really hard questions about what that particular inflection point in the curve meant. And this guy couldn't explain it. It was an obvious question, and you could just see his credibility evaporating. And so, yeah, never puts a metric in front of somebody that you don't really understand yourself. The other thing I would say is, I think this is to the questioner's point. Was this Mark Tomlinson? To his point, I would say we definitely do have a problem. I refer to this as the fire hose of data problem, where we just take a lot of raw data. It's not even really metrics so much as it's just raw, unprocessed data, like raw test case counts and spreadsheets and raw performance numbers and so forth, and spray them out to all of the project stakeholders and expect them to magically figure out what that stuff means. We have to remember that, especially if you've been in testing 10, 15, 20 years, that there's what's obvious and clear to you, and there's what's going to be completely inscrutable to people in your audience. And part of your job as a source of information is to figure out how to present that information in a way that the audience can get it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we're seeing out there, people talking about, is we take metrics, and Jay made a point. I've seen her make it before, and she's made it today on Twitter. Is that people sometimes take a metric just because they've heard of it. So let's use one that everybody's using because it's a cool name. It's the buzzword in metrics, and then they don't understand how to run with it. I think that misleads organizations, and then people get an understanding. I've seen metrics where the people that are creating the metrics and the people that are reporting the metrics and the people that are reading the metrics have three different opinions on what you're saying. And I think that's a big problem in organizations, is someone's reading this report a different way than I'm reading it as a test manager, or the development team's reading it. And I think it's critical to make sure that you educate the teams, and whatever you do choose for measuring your testing progress or your testing efforts needs to be, clearly understood by the people that are creating and reading those.
I totally agree. And to go back to that buzzword thing that you mentioned, I think that is a real problem too. I've seen this in a few cases with pairwise testing, where people get a hold of some sort of pairwise test design tool, and they just they just think this is the cat's meow, and they're off doing pairwise testing here and pairwise testing there, and their managers are like going pairwise this and pairwise that, and I'm like, well, why are you doing this? What are you learning from pairwise testing that you wouldn't have learned from doing boundary value analysis and equivalence partitioning at a much lower cost. What additional risk mitigation are you getting out of this? And the answer is this sort of look of surprise, like I don't know. I never thought to ask that question.
So true. So one question from Rainer I had way back, and I'm trying to catch up with a couple of questions. We still got some coming in, and I know folks, we're running 6 minutes away from 12 o'clock. We can go to about 12 to 15 after the hour to take questions, but we do want to wrap up what material we had. But one question from Rainer was, I think that apart from measuring metrics and creating reports, it's important to react on the measured metrics. For example, in case there are lots of defects in a module or a test object, then maybe more test cases need to be specified for that module. Where you find a lot of defects that are probably much more, that kind of, I can agree with that, because I've seen organizations look at this developer has a lot of issues, so we're going to make sure we track them and track their progress, their modules, because they may have the same, they may be prone to have more defects or not understand the requirements. What do you guys think on that?
Well, I mean, and for breaking down the modules, it's one of the big things that I always talk about, not just doing a total number, but doing it more down at the lower level, because if you break down, your test cases by functions as well as your defects, logging them by the functions as well, you can actually tie, how many defects are actually occurring within that, function of the testing. So that's one of the main reasons why I always push for that kind of item. And also the other reason why, that kind of metrics is a lot better to be used, because developers are going to be able to understand it better when they see from a functionality, because they develop, more from a functionality basis. And I'm not saying every company does it, but most companies do, they'll focus on a change password area, for example. And even your requirements are more at a component or a module level. So that's kind of why those are the kind of metrics that I personally would say push more for, versus just throwing everything together and just putting a pretty chart.
To organize it in a way that makes sense to different audience members, and the business analyst looks at it from a different perspective than the project manager, than the developer, etc.
Yeah. So Jay sent me this slide, and I laughed a long time before I actually added it to the deck. But I think it's true. We do this in organizations. People are looking at productivity based on the type of pants, and sweatpants is getting more productivity than jeans, which is getting more than khakis, which is getting more than dress pants, which is barely getting more than no pants. And I think, you've heard of I go back to the same story I mentioned earlier. You've heard of people saying, we've changed the lighting, we want to see how that measures productivity. And productivity goes up because people know they're being measured. And I think metrics like this are ones you definitely want to avoid. And I'll open the floor up for you guys to add to that.
This is my favorite slide. It's the perfect example of how a metric, if not understood, can be taken totally out of context.
Well, I think there's also this is a classic illustration of the mistaking correlation for causality. There could be any number of reasons why the least productive person is coming in wearing no pants. You don't say what they're wearing. Maybe they're wearing a skirt. But I mean, you don't know. Maybe they're wearing a kilt. I mean, where's the causality there, right? I mean, you have correlation, but you've got no sort of theory of how one thing leads to another. And that mistake from a statistical point of view is the basis of a lot of bad thinking.
Yeah, I agree. Anything else from the panel or from folks? Okay, hold on. I've got yeah. All right, so let's go to the final question that we had for the group, and that is, what tools or processes can best assist an organization in delivering accurate and meaningful quality metrics? And I'll add to this a question from the audience from Steve, which says, how often should metrics be placed in front of stakeholders? Weekly, monthly, you know, what is the frequency? So let's kind of roll that into this question as well.
Well, that's actually twofold. For one, from a tools or a process standpoint, one of the things that we use is a product called Team Quality Pro that actually, what we do is we verify which metrics, an organization really needs to know and understand, and then we implement those in order to determine, one, that we can actually reproduce it, because that's one thing is you don't want to have a metric that shows, one thing 1 week and then 3 weeks later show something totally different, because then no one's going to really understand what you're trying to display. So if you can create something that, is repeatable, understandable, and one of the main things I always look for is something that could be automated, because then it's less people focusing on pulling the metrics, but more people are really doing the work and actually reviewing the metrics. That's better. To discuss about how many times you should present it to your stakeholders, personally, I believe in having the metric available to people whenever they need it. So that's one of the reasons why we went to an automated dashboard route, is because anybody can go to it anytime, even via the mobile device, and they can see it. It's one, because nobody's surprised at the last minute of, when you have your go, no-go meetings, nobody's shocked at the last minute that, oh, there's 5 critical showstoppers and there's an entire functionality that wasn't tested yet. Everybody's aware of it. But the one thing to always also keep in mind is, once you set up a pattern of when your metrics are going to be delivered, try to make sure you keep that pattern, because people are going to be looking for it. And if it's out of date, people may not realize they're out of date. So that's one of the other reasons that whatever kind of metric you have, whether it's an automated dashboard or if you're doing it manual, always state somewhere on it when it was last updated. Because that's one problem I see a lot of times, where people are coming to a meeting and their metric is outdated and they're not really sure what's really happening at that point of time.
I'd like to take on this a pair of questions here too. It's I think it's important that we start, as I said before, with the objectives and create our metrics and the goals for those metrics based on those objectives. And at that point, it's time to find the appropriate tool to serve as a collection mechanism and configure that tool to do the collection for us properly. I think all too often one of the things that I've seen is organizations that just got a tool and assumed, a test management tool, and just assumed, oh, whatever this thing spits out must be what everybody needs. It's back to that one-size-fits-all standardization of results reporting comment or question earlier. And so that again leads to that fire hose of data problem, and people are just spraying down all of the project stakeholders with everything that they can possibly produce from this test management tool. And you look and say, well, what does that mean? What is that telling you? Where's the decision making? And they don't know. So that's just it's a symptom of starting at the wrong end of the problem. So I'd say yes, start with the objectives first, and then think about the tool. In terms of reporting frequency, I would say, this is a function of the audience needs. I would agree with Jay that, a poll model can work, allowing people to pull the information when they need it, and definitely that date last updated, date and time last updated information would be important. So I'd agree with that. But I also would say that I've known managers that really would need a push model, that they wouldn't necessarily think to go out and pull that information. And of course, we might become aware of some information that somebody really needs to have, and they're not going to know to pull that chart. So we have to be ready to push information to the audience based on their needs. So we're still back to, you got to understand what the audience needs are, including the frequency of updates.
Yeah, and one of the things that we made sure, because I agree, people don't always go to the metric, even when it is online. It's, you know, why didn't you tell us this happened? Well, it's been there every day. Why didn't you go check it? So we actually started implementing a functionality where we actually have notifications. So then if there's a way that, you know, kind of like ClearQuest, you know, if you guys log defects in ClearQuest, it sends, and I can't say every company does this, but, you know, companies have notifications. You can do the same thing in your dashboard system. You know, have it send a notification to make that stakeholder go and look at it. This way they're not shocked at the last minute.
Okay. We're running just a little over. Jay had 2 slides from some of the work that she has done. I wanted her to share with everyone and just go through those.
Sure. This is kind of one of the things that, you know, I was talking about earlier about the module based versus instead of just showing here's a total number of test cases. And this is one from a finished project, of course, but it actually showed, you know, with the finished and the pass rate. But the main functionality that we implemented here was because it's by the module, so you can determine from a module what area is really passing versus failing. And of course, for stakeholders or managers that still wanted a total, we give them the total at the bottom, but at least you can see where things are failing versus not, and also what the percentage is. Then on the next slide, the big thing is, you know, everybody has defects, violations. I know everybody would prefer they had none in their applications, but it will happen no matter what. So one of the big things we implemented across the board was a scorecard to show, you know, are you going up or are you going down? Because everybody wants to look at what's wrong with the project or with an application, but nobody really points out what about what's going good with the project. So this is kind of a really good scorecard that you can see, you know, from 1 month to another or one release to another. You can see if you're staying the same. So we kind of use kind of like a stoplight, red, green, yellow. You know, whether you're going up or going down or better. So that's another good thing that I say to do in metrics is also don't just point out the bad stuff about what's going on in your applications. Also show what's going good because, you know, your stakeholders are going to want to also know what, you know, your team's doing that's making the job and the organization better in the long run.
That's really good, Jay, and thanks. I've not seen this type of dashboard here before, so it's very interesting and definitely something we should look at. So we can take questions for the next 5 to 10 minutes, just a little bit over 5 minutes that we have left. I'm shocked and happy that that most of the people that joined us initially are still on with us. If you guys want to skip to the next slide, we wanted to show everyone if you've got a QR reader, a QR code reader, you can scan these, go right to our website. Jay is nice, the rest of us. But we'll also put our Twitter handles there. If you're not on Twitter, you should be because there's a lot of good discussions and topics. Even as we did this webinar, there was good discussions and topics, which I think you'll find interesting if you follow us, the 3 of us on Twitter. But please, you know, scan these, go to our web pages, you know, follow us, and you know, everyone has a different opinion, and especially in the testing world, more than I think in any other profession. And I think it's good to kind of get bits and pieces from everybody and learn from it. So we'll take some more questions. If anybody has questions, please type them, and we will we'll pull them in. And what I'm thinking is, and we've talked about this, is I may open a blog on my page where we can have folks come in and ask more questions about this topic. We can keep rolling this topic forward. I think it's, you know, this is one of these types of topics that could last for a lot longer than an hour.
Yes, and Mike, if we get any questions after the fact at services@xcosoft.com, we can always get in touch with you and Rex and Jay and get some answers and then post those as well.
Okay. I have a lot of people responding that this was a great webinar. It's good topics, most engaging. We do appreciate that. I think, this is one of those topics that you could have in a 1 and 2 hour course at a conference and really get a lot of interaction, where people can speak up and talk. But one question from Mark here is, the dashboard makes me want to ask, what's the difference between metrics that seek to measure internal health efficiency of the testing effort versus metrics that seek to measure the value of the testing outcomes to the business?
Is that a general question about test dashboards, or is that about the one we were just looking at?
I think it's general, because it said that it was saying that the dashboard makes me want to ask this. But yeah, what would be the difference between metrics that measure the internal health and efficiency of testing versus metrics that seek to measure the value of the testing?
Well, if we're talking about the health of the testing or the health of the project, I think it's important that you be clear on that. If you're trying to measure just, the test progress, that's not really, you're not just measuring the health of the testing, because the test progress is obviously very much influenced by the health of the project overall. But I would agree that that the health of the project is measuring that's entirely different than measuring the value of the testing. And if you're measuring the value of the testing, again, you've got to go back to what are the objectives that people are trying to achieve, such as finding defects or reducing risk, but building confidence and so forth, and then come up with a metric that allows you to measure how well your test process is achieving those measurements. And usually process metrics are different than a project metric.
True. We have, I think we're ready. And Amy, Jan, tell me, we have like 4 minutes. So let me know, you can cut us off. The next question from Amaresh was, can you explain the difference between process and people metrics?
Yeah, I guess I'll take that one since that's my hobby horse. Yeah, so an example of a process metric would be the defect detection percentage. So if we look at what percentage of defects are detected by a test process prior to release, then that's a way of measuring the testing process's capabilities at finding defects. Now, obviously, there can be external factors that influence that, so it's not purely a measure of the test process, but it's focused on the test process. A people metric, I would say, I'm going to mention what I would consider to be good people metrics here. A good people metric would be to come up with a way of measuring people in terms of skills, doing skills inventories on people, and measuring how much their skills have improved over the course of the year. Because that's now something that's within somebody's control. They can take charge of their skills growth and make sure that with the help of their manager, they're put into positions where they can grow more in skills, apply new skills, and so forth. So those would be examples of 2 different metrics, one process and one people, that I think are good metrics to use.
Okay.
It's just about 13 after the hour. So I can just, pull the chat log and see what else is unanswered and then get back to you after the webinar, if that works for Mike and Jay and Rex?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you.
I'll close with one thought, Amy, and someone had given me this, promised I would share this, but we rely on historical data too much for deriving metrics that are forecasting the future, or the, things in forecasting in nature. So I promised someone I would send this message out, and I wanted to add that in there. Thanks to everyone that joined the panel with us, and thanks to XPOSoft for having us.
Yes, thank you very much to Mike and Jay and Rex for this great discussion and webinar today, and thank you all for attending. Look for an email with links to both the presentation and the slide share, and the recording. They'll be emailed to you in a couple of days, and then if any questions that follow or go unanswered, we will also get that information out to you as well. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.